Chapter 5, the United States west of the Mississippi River. We're going to continue our study of the United States, its physical geography, the history of this area in this region, how it's been settled, and now what it's like to live here today by expanding from the east coast to the Mississippi River and now west of the Mississippi River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. You can see here in our chapter opener, the place and time, it gives us a way in which to see every single one of those states that is now included in our study of the United States, including the two states that are not contiguous, not are attached. So Alaska, which is up here attached to Canada, and then Hawaii, the set of islands out here in the Pacific Ocean, make up all of what would be the 50 states that we're studying. You've already been given the task of learning these 50 states and the capitals of those states and using your study tool resource to figure out where every single one of those states are and getting more familiar with it, because it's going to be beneficial as we jump into learning about the physical geography, the history, and the daily life of this entire wonderful country that we get to call our own. Let's jump into Lesson 1 today, the physical geography. I click on this tab right up here at the top, Lesson 1, and it should open to my reading. Again, you're welcome to click on the headphones portion up here to listen to the narration for each of these individual pages and the entire thing together. And while you are listening and or reading to this bit of material, you should have your notes in front of you for this section. We're filling out the guided reading activity for the physical landscape, the bodies of water, and the climates of the region to learn about the physical geography altogether. Let's take a look at what's expected for each of those parts of notes, and then we'll come back to this as we go through each section. In the initial portion of our study, the physical landscape, we're asked to read the section and use your textbook to answer the following questions about landforms that make up the United States west of the Mississippi. Here are our target questions. Are the Great Plains flat? Just because it says plains doesn't necessarily mean that flat is the shape that we would describe of those areas. Number 2, what makes the Rocky Mountains a cordillera or cordillera? Number 3, what mountain range near the Pacific coast still has active volcanoes? Number 4, what is a plateau? Number 5, what landforms make up Alaska? At the end of the physical landscape portion, we're actually going to compare Alaska and Hawaii, as they are the non-contiguous states, the non-attached states in the United States, and what they have in terms of similarities and differences in their physical landscape. Let's jump into that section, and we'll come back to this page to make sure that we've got all those bases covered. The USA west of the Mississippi. Our essential question is, how does geography influence the way people live? Think about what it would be like to experience life in this part of the world based on how these places are described. It's going to be somewhat different from what we're used to here in the Midwest as you move further west in our country. Here again is a map of what this western region looks like, and if you're comparing to the eastern half of the country, the western half is much larger and much more expansive. A lot of the states in this part of the country actually occupy a lot larger area and more overall land mass than the eastern half of the United States. The Mississippi River, being the major river in the United States, is just a good way to split what would be considered the east and the western part of our country, using that kind of natural divide, even though the western half is bigger than that eastern portion that we've previously studied. So, the physical landscape. The Mississippi River divides the United States into two parts. These two regions are not equal in size. The area of the western Mississippi is larger than the area to the east. The states to the west differ from each other in some ways. At the same time, they offer more in common with each other than the states east of the Mississippi River. The western states are typically larger than the eastern states. Their human populations are generally more spread out across these vast distances. Their landforms are steeper and rockier than in the eastern states, and their climates overall are much drier. Many of the western states are richer in natural resources. The Great Plains. Just west of the Mississippi River lie the Great Plains. In many places the plains appear flat, but in other places the plains are generally rolling lands. In spite of their flat appearance, however, the plains are tilted downward toward the east. In eastern Nebraska, for example, the elevation of the land is less than 1,500 feet above sea level, but on western edge of Nebraska, the land rises to about 6,000 feet. That's a difference of 4,500 feet, which is almost the difference of a mile. A mile is 5,280 feet, so you're talking a difference in mile in elevation, which means that even the Great Plains are not flat. That was question number 1. The Great Plains were once covered by wild grasses. Vast herds of bison and pronghorn, the American antelope, grazed there. Today, the Great Plains are covered by farms and ranches. Mountain and hills, page 149. Toward the north, the Great Plains are interrupted by the Black Hills. These hills were once mountains, but over time they've eroded. Evergreen trees appear to darken the hills, giving them their name. West of the Great Plains tower the Rocky Mountains. The Rockies are not a single mountain chain, but a cordillera. A cordillera is a region of parallel mountain chains, and the Rockies include dozens of different mountain systems. They extend from the Canadian border to the Mexican border. Peaks soar up to 14,000 feet, and the valleys plunge thousands of feet below. Many of the mountains are snow-capped. Trees cover the slopes, but not above the timberline. At that elevation, the climate is too cold for trees to grow. Here's an example of that increased elevation. Trees only grow to a certain point, and you can see on the side of this mountain, normally, this is a summertime picture, normally this would entirely be covered by snow, and the trees are actually only able to grow to a certain elevation because the higher you go up in elevation, the colder the temperature is throughout the entire year. So trees and certain types of vegetation cannot survive in that extreme elevation, probably because of that overall temperature and climate, and because of the massive amount of snow that they're going to get in those areas. But you still do see this timber line, this tree line, where as you go lower in elevation on the mountainside, they're able to grow. Several different mountain ranges tower over the Pacific coast. Many of these mountains formed because plate tectonics exert pressure on Earth's lithosphere. This caused the lithosphere to crack and the broken land to rise into steep, rugged mountains. Among them are the Olympic Mountains of Washington. Heavy rainfall and cold temperatures form glaciers on these mountains. So as you go to the Pacific Northwest, the mountains tend to look a little bit different and have a little bit different landscape. About 150 miles east of the Pacific coast are two higher ranges, the Cascades. These run from the north-south through western Oregon and the Washington state. The Cascades are volcanic, and some of the volcanoes are still active. The Cascades are volcanic. Just checking in on our note page. What makes the Great Plains flat? We answered that. What makes the Rocky Mountains a cordillera? That talks about how they're parallel. There's multiple mountain ranges that are running parallel to each other. The last one was what mountain range near the Pacific coast still has active volcanoes? If you're following in our reading, you would have learned that that was the Cascades. The Cascades are volcanic, and some of the volcanoes are still active. The Sierra Nevada range runs along the California-Nevada border. The name Sierra Nevada comes from the Spanish form Snowy Mountains. These mountains include Mount Whitney, which is about 14,500 feet. It is the highest point in the 48 contiguous states. Contiguous means connected to. The contiguous states are those that stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Alaska and Hawaii are not among them. This point is given the distinction highest in the contiguous states because there are mountains that are higher than that when you go up into Alaska, the Denali mountain range. Between the coastal mountains and the line of the Sierras and the Cascades are long, low valleys. This lowland area is called the Central Valley in California. In Oregon, it's called the Willamette Valley. So wherever you have these drastic changes in elevation of increased elevation, you usually have the opposite to where there is some type of valley. Let's describe these. Basins and plateaus. You might recognize this canyon that's on the screen right now because it's probably the most famous worldwide in terms of geography places that you can go visit. That's the opposite in elevation. Instead of being up, it's downward. This is the Grand Canyon. Between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Range is a mix of landforms. They can be grouped into three sections. To the south and to the east is the Colorado Plateau. Plateau is a large area of generally flat land. This highland area is marked by smaller, flat-topped features called mesas. They are sometimes separated by canyons. In addition, many canyons cut deep into the Colorado Plateau. Among these canyons is the Grand Canyon. Winding along the canyon floor, more than 1 mile below the rim is the Colorado River. Rising up to the plateau are the rocks of many colors and shapes. The spectacular sight attracts more than 4 million visitors every single year. West of the Colorado Plateau and extending to the north is the Basin and Range region. This name refers to a pattern on the land in which clusters of steep, high mountains are separated by low-lying basins. To the north is the Columbia Basin. This large area was formed mainly by vast amounts of lava that flowed from volcanoes and then cooled and hardened. Much of the area is flat, but rivers cut deep valleys and canyons. Might answer a question for us here. What's a plateau? Should give us that relatively high elevation yet flat on top, not like a mountain, but overall flat. Next question looks for what those mountains look like and what the difference is between Alaska and Hawaii. Landforms of Alaska. Alaska, the largest U.S. state in land area, lies to the west of Canada. Mountains run along its southern and northern edges. The Alaska Range, also in the south, is home of the highest point in the United States, Mount McKinley, also called Denali. The mountain soars 20,320 feet high. Lowland plains cover the area between Alaskan Range and the northern mountains. So that describes it for you. The landforms of Hawaii. Nearly 2,400 miles southwest of California is Hawaii, an archipelago, meaning a group of islands. Hawaii includes more than 130 islands. The 8 largest ones in the eastern part of the chain of islands. The volcanoes form these islands. 2 volcanoes, Mauna Loa and Kilauea, are still active. Wind and sea have eroded some of the mountains to make steep cliffs, and along the shores, some islands have sandy beaches that draw many, many tourists. So some of them have these massive changes in elevation that are similar maybe to Alaska and Hawaii, but their climates are very different because Alaska is so much further north and away from the equator, where Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's more of a tropical destination, where here you have more of that rugged and new frontier type of landscape. That's an answer all the questions for the first section. As we move into our study of the bodies of water, you're going to label each description with the correct body of water. Here are the descriptions. Hopefully you can pick those out as Mr. Shane reads through this section. Before we read through this section, let's quickly review what those different types of landforms are and where they show up in the western United States. We've got plains, hills, mountain ranges, plateaus, mesas, archipelagos, and the last one that showed up for us, if that little slide thing gets out of the way, we can see what that is, volcanoes. Here's a description of what those are, and maybe you saw the examples that were in our reading. The bodies of water. The United States west of the Mississippi River is much drier than the eastern part of the country. As a result, it has fewer rivers and lakes. Those that do exist play significant roles in the area's economy. One of the reasons why it's drier in this part of the country is because of the Rocky Mountains creating this rain shadow on one side and on the other. So where you have mountains, a lot of times certain areas get more rain than others. It's also because you get this huge change in elevation. Rivers are a lot easier to flow and move through a landscape if that landscape is relatively flat. If you've got a changing landscape like mountainous and valleys or mountain plateaus and basins, that water moves relatively quickly through that region, and even in the Grand Canyon's case, it kind of cuts and down and erodes that region. So the eastern half of the United States is much flatter, therefore there's a lot more water that can settle and kind of move slowly through that area. In the western half of the United States, it goes a lot quicker because of that elevation change. The ocean and Gulf. Chief body of water for this region is the Pacific Ocean. This vast ocean meets the western shores of the continental United States and of Alaska. Hawaii sits in the midst, and inlets from the ocean create many excellent harbors along the Pacific coast. As a result, the coast has many major ports. They include San Diego, Long Beach, and Los Angeles, California, Portland, Oregon, and Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. Valdez, Alaska, and Honolulu are also important Pacific ports. Louisiana and Texas border the Gulf of Mexico. They both have several major ports, including those of New Orleans and Houston. The coastlines of the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico are very different. Plate tectonics are active along the Pacific coast. This not only causes earthquakes, but also makes for a steep coastline with rocky cliffs. The Gulf Coast is much more stable and very flat. It has many swamps and shallow water. Lakes of the region. Because of the western United States has a fairly dry climate, lakes are not as common in this region as east of the Mississippi. But thousands of years ago, the climate was wetter. A huge freshwater lake covered many of the basins that are located in what are now Utah, Idaho, and Nevada. Today, only a few isolated lakes remain. One of them is Utah's Great Salt Lake. It is the largest salt lake in the Americas. The lake changes in size gradually because of varying amount of water that evaporates from it. The lake is salty because it does not have an outlet. Tributary rivers bring salt to the lake, and then they stay right there. Evaporation takes the water away, but leaves the salt behind. Two other important lakes in the region are Lake Tahoe and Lake Mead. Lake Tahoe sits high in the Sierra Nevada. Lake Mead is a human-made lake formed when the Hoover Dam was built in the Colorado River, and that's shown on page 152. Both lakes are used for boating and other types of water recreation. Rivers. Rivers are important into the western United States. The Colorado is one of the major rivers of the region. It begins along the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, and it twists its way south in the west of the Gulf of California. At many places along its course, the Colorado has been dammed. So much of the river's water is used for farming and in the cities that no water at all reaches the Gulf of California. To the north, the Columbia River flows from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. It has been dammed in several places to provide hydroelectric power. The Snake and Willamette rivers feed into this river. All these rivers flow west, but some of the rivers in the region flow east toward the Gulf of Mexico. This continental divide, which is an imaginary line through the Rocky Mountains, separates these two sets of rivers. The eastward flowing rivers include the Missouri, the Platte, the Kansas, the Arkansas, and the Rio Grande. The first four of these rivers feed into the Mississippi. The dams and all the rivers bring much benefit to the people in the region. They control floods, generate hydroelectric power, and provide water for urban and rural areas. The dams also greatly affect the hydrosphere and biosphere. Without dams, the rivers flow fast and during cold springtime when snows are melting. Then in summer, they flow slowly and are much warmer. The bodies of water. To summarize, the U.S. West Coast borders the Pacific, the Louisiana and Texas border the Gulf of Mexico, so you have the connection to kind of two of those major oceans. The western United States has few large lakes because of its dry climate, and it has many major rivers, some of them flowing east towards the Mississippi and some of them flowing west towards the Pacific, and a continental divide separates where that flow happens. Through your note section, you should be able to identify the label or the correct description of each of those different major bodies of water. In the next section, the climates of the region, you're going to use your textbook to decide if each of these statements is true or false. Write true or false in the blank. If the statement is false, rewrite it correctly. So let's preface our reading. Here's a good reading strategy. Let's read through these questions first to see if we recognize them as we're going through. We know what to look for in terms of being true or false. Number 1, the United States west of the Mississippi has a common climate. Number 2, because of the rain shadow caused by coastal mountain ranges, areas to the east are drier than areas to the west of the mountains. Number 3, the Great Plains has 3 different climate types: semi-arid, humid continental, and humid subtropical. Number 4, Alaska has mostly cool and cold climates with temperatures warmer in the north and colder in the south. Number 5, the climate in Hawaii is mostly warm and dry. Now let's refer back to those as we read through this section. Climates of the region. The United States west of the Mississippi has many different climates. Tropical rainforests cover parts of Washington and Oregon because of many storms that come from the North Pacific Ocean. Dry, hot deserts cover large parts of the Southwest. Coastal and highland climates. High mountains play a role in forming climates in the region. The western mountains cause what is called a rain shadow. West-facing slopes of the Pacific Coastal Range, the Cascades, and the Sierra Nevada receive plentiful rain and snow from Pacific Ocean storms. Heavy rains give Northern California, Oregon, and Washington a marine west coast climate. Vast forests grow here. The valley to the east of the coastal range lie in rain shadows, so they are very dry. Although California's Central Valley lies in the rain shadow, it is a major farming region. It is hot and dry, but is located near the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada, which receive an abundant amount of rain. Mountain rainwater is used for irrigation in the valley. Irrigation is the process by which water is supplied to dry land. Bottom of the picture on page 153 shows you what that looks like, where you're taking water that's either being pumped out of a river or out of the water table in the ground and then spreading it out onto the crops so that you can grow things in those areas that are drier. In areas that receive enough rain, then you don't usually have to rely on irrigation. Climates in the interior. The high mountains of the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada produce a rain shadow effect that keeps the interior of the region dry. This dry climate is what causes so much evaporation from Great Salt Lake. Some areas are covered by large deserts. The western Great Plains have a semi-arid climate. A semi-arid area receives more rain than the desert, but not enough for trees to grow. Instead, semi-arid areas have bushes and grasslands. Temperatures in the Great Plains get hot in the summer and cold in the winter. This is what is known as the humid continental climate. Sometimes in the winter, a dry wind called the Chinook blows over the region. It originates in the mountains where it is cold, but the air heats up as it blows down the eastern slopes of the mountain. The eastern half of the plains has 2 climate types. The northern part has a humid continental climate. It is influenced by cold air masses moving down from the Arctic. The climate of the southern part is humid subtropical. It is shaped by warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. It has higher temperatures than that of the northern plains. When cold, dry air from the north collides with warm, moist air from the south, thunderstorms and even tornadoes can result in this kind of tornado valley right through the middle of our country between that north and south where those climates are varying. Climates of Hawaii and Alaska. Climates in Alaska are generally moderate but cool and cold. More moderate temperatures occur toward the south and colder ones to the north. Winters are cold in the far south. Snow can be heavy in the south and southeast. Valdez can reach as much as 200 inches of snow per year. Hawaii has a tropical rainforest climate with high temperatures and high levels of rainfall. Rain tends to be heaviest in the winter. More rain falls on the northeastern side of mountains because the moist wind comes from that direction. Steady ocean breezes keep that air comfortable even when temperatures are high. To summarize that, I have on this note page that high mountain have an effect on the coastal and highland regions. Western-facing slopes receive rain and snow, while the valleys to the east are dry. Climates in the interior region are generally dry. There's two major climates for what would be considered the Great Plains. Hopefully that answers the question for your true and false. If you'd like to go back and rewatch what Mr. Shane just read through to help you answer these, that would be beneficial. Remember, if it's true, write T. If it's false, write F, and then change what's wrong in the statement itself. In the last portion of our notes, we're taking a look at the resources in this region, and they're going to be grouped into three categories. So you're working on the skill of categorizing and finding which of those resources are energy resources, which of those resources are just pure minerals, and which one don't really fall into a category and they're considered other resources. This is also signified by the headings of each of the sections that we're reading through. So if I jump ahead to where we're talking about the resources in this region, you can see that where it talks about energy resources, where it talks about mineral resources, where it talks about other resources, is probably where you're going to find the context for each of those that you're filling in the blank. Remember to fill those in appropriately. There's 5 energy resources, there are 5 mineral resources, and there are 3 that are designated as other resources. Let's get into it. The United States west of the Mississippi River has a great variety of natural resources. In addition to land that supports raising livestock, rich reserves of petroleum, minerals, and a variety of energy resources are found here. Energy resources. So here's some of those that you might be writing into those blanks on your note page. It just looks a little different on Mr. Shane's screen here. Energy resources. The United States west of the Mississippi has large reserves of energy resources. Petroleum is found in the Gulf of Mexico, near Louisiana and Texas, in the southern Great Plains in California and in Alaska. Natural gas is found in the same areas. Coal is abundant in Wyoming. A growing source of energy coming from the region is ethanol. Ethanol is a liquid fuel made from plants. In the United States, ethanol is made from corn and blended with gasoline. The United States is one of the world's leading producers of ethanol. Hydroelectric power is an important source of energy in this region. Dams along the Columbia and Colorado rivers supply this power. Wind power is a growing source of energy here. South Dakota gets nearly a quarter of its electricity from wind power, more than any other state. Solar power is also becoming more important. So let's just back up and see which ones of those you had identified as energy resources. Petroleum, which is the form of crude oil or oil itself that's turned into oil and gasoline. You've got natural gas, you have wind power, you have solar power, you have coal. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 energy resources. Another one you could probably consider would be hydroelectric power because of the way in which you're going to turn moving water into electricity as well as a form of energy. Take a look at the mineral resources. The Rocky Mountains are important sources of gold, silver, copper, zinc, and lead. There's our 5 mineral resources. Timber is an important resource too. Fertile soil makes the plains of California's Central Valley and parts of Oregon and Washington are major farming regions. So in the category of other, you have timber and fertile soil. Another important resource in this region is the natural beauty. Just the natural landscape of the western United States is a big, huge pull for people to go and visit those places, and it's also a thing that we want to conserve and keep for as long as we possibly can. Another important resource of the region is natural beauty. Large areas of great natural beauty have been set aside in national parks. These parks attract millions of visitors per year. In the terms of the other resources, you can say the fertile soil and cattle for farming and the timber. In terms of the mineral resources, it listed at the beginning of that paragraph those 5 different things that are mined out of the ground that are coming from what is naturally in that soil. Your homework is to make sure that your notes are adequately complete and that you've understood everything, comprehended everything that we have read. Feel free to pause this video at any time to do the reading on your own, or obviously to listen to Mr. Shane all the way through. Hope this helps.